The cold beginning. The great halls of the alien palace shimmered with golden light, but to her, they felt cold and empty. The princess stood at the center of the throne room, her small frame dwarfed by the towering walls around her. She was only 4 feet tall, with emerald green skin that glistened under the crystal chandeliers. Her beauty was legendary in her kingdom. Long, flowing silver hair, deep amber eyes, and a smile that could once melt hearts. But today, there was no smile. The alien king, tall and imposing, sat on his grand throne. His voice boomed across the room, echoing with finality. "You have failed me," he declared, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "A queen who cannot bear children is no queen at all." The words stabbed her heart like a dagger. She had pleaded with him, tried to make him understand that her worth was more than her ability to produce heirs. She was a brilliant strategist, a compassionate leader, and a fierce defender of their people. But none of it mattered to the king. To him, she was now useless, a broken jewel, no longer worthy of her place beside him. "I gave you everything," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "I stood by you in every battle, every storm. Is this how you repay loyalty?" The king's face remained cold, unmoved by her pain. "You are no longer my queen. Leave this palace, leave this world, and never return." The guards stepped forward, their silver armor gleaming, and gestured for her to follow. She didn't fight them. What would be the point? Her shoulders sagged as she turned to walk away, but she kept her head high. If this was the end of her life in the palace, she would not let them see her break. The princess was escorted to a small spacecraft, her only belongings packed into a single bag. She glanced one last time at the palace that had been her home. The golden towers, the lush gardens, the grand halls, all of it now felt like a cruel dream. She had been thrown away like a piece of unwanted trash. As the spacecraft's doors closed behind her, she vowed never to look back. The ship took off, the stars blurring into streaks of light as it entered hyperspace. She didn't know where she was going. The coordinates had been programmed by the king's advisors, a random, uninhabited planet in a distant system, a place where no one would ever find her, or so they thought. When the ship landed, the princess stepped out into a harsh, barren landscape. The ground was rocky and dry, the air thin and cold. Strange purple plants grew in patches, their sharp leaves swaying in the wind. There were no signs of life, no sounds except the howling breeze. The princess wrapped her silver cloak tighter around her, her heart sinking. This was to be her new home. For hours, she wandered the desolate terrain, searching for shelter. Her alien physiology allowed her to endure extreme conditions, but even she was beginning to feel the toll of exhaustion. Her feet ached, her throat was dry, and her spirit was dangerously close to breaking. Just as despair began to creep in, she spotted something in the distance, a faint light flickering against the darkening sky. Her amber eyes widened with hope. Could it be a settlement? Life? She quickened her pace, her legs trembling but her determination growing. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing a small human outpost nestled against a rocky cliff. It was modest, nothing like the grandeur of the palace, but it was warm and alive. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear faint sounds of movement and conversation. The princess hesitated, fear and hope battling within her. Would the humans accept her? She was not like them. Her green skin, her glowing eyes, her height, all of it marked her as alien. But she had no choice. She needed warmth, food, and perhaps a sliver of kindness. She took a deep breath and stepped into the light of the settlement. The first human she saw was a man, tall and rugged, with a look of both curiosity and caution. He held a tool in his hand, pausing mid-task as he noticed her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice uncertain but not unkind. The princess swallowed hard, her voice soft but steady. "I am a traveler," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I seek refuge." The man studied her, his gaze flickering over her alien features. He could have turned her away, could have called for others to chase her off. But instead, he nodded. "Come inside," he said simply, gesturing toward a nearby structure. Relief flooded through her as she followed him. The warmth of the human outpost wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing her weary soul. For the first time since her exile, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something better. Little did she know, her journey was only just beginning. A new world, a new hope. The princess stepped into the warm confines of the human outpost, her delicate form trembling not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty that gnawed at her heart. The structure was small compared to the grand halls she once called home, but it carried an unfamiliar warmth that felt oddly comforting. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. The air smelled of something cooking, an aroma that made her stomach growl softly, reminding her how long it had been since she'd eaten. The man who had let her in, Jake, watched her with curious eyes. He was tall, with a rugged face weathered by years of hard labor. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his hands were calloused. But his gaze was neither hostile nor dismissive. Instead, it held a cautious kindness that she hadn't expected. "Sit down," Jake said, gesturing toward a chair by the fire. "You look like you've been through hell." She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should trust him. But the fire's warmth was too inviting, and she didn't have the strength to stand on ceremony. She lowered herself into the chair, her silver cloak pooling around her feet like liquid moonlight. The heat from the flames seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill that had settled there. Jake sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone more of a statement than a question. The princess nodded, her amber eyes meeting his. "I am, from far away." Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but not pressing. "What's your name?" She hesitated. The name she carried in her own tongue felt too alien, too tied to the life she had been cast out from. She decided on something simpler. "Call me Rhea," she said softly. "Rhea," Jake repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "Well, Rhea, you've got the look of someone who's been running from something. Care to tell me what it is?" Her chest tightened. The memories of her exile, the king's cruel words, the endless expanse of space, everything came rushing back. But she wasn't ready to share it all. Not yet. "I've lost everything," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need a place to rest, to think." Jake nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she was saying. "Well, you're safe here. At least for now. This outpost doesn't see much traffic, just a few traders passing through, and they're not due for another month." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Safe. The word felt foreign to her now, but she clung to it like a lifeline. As the evening wore on, Jake busied himself with small tasks, giving her space. He handed her a bowl of stew, its warmth and flavor more satisfying than any royal feast she could remember. She watched him silently, noting the way he moved with a quiet efficiency, his actions deliberate but unhurried. There was a steadiness to him that felt grounding, like the solid ground beneath her feet after years adrift in the void. But Rhea's peace was fleeting. As she sat by the fire, a faint hum began to resonate in her mind, a subtle but unmistakable sensation. It was a warning, one that only her kind could perceive. Somewhere, out in the darkness of the cosmos, something was looking for her. Her hand instinctively went to the small device hidden in her cloak, a piece of alien technology that allowed her to scan for life forms and track energy signatures. Activating it discreetly, she saw the faint pulse of an unfamiliar signal approaching the planet's orbit. Her heart sank. The king's soldiers. They had found her. Jake noticed her sudden stillness. "You all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. She looked up at him, her expression guarded. I need to leave soon." "Leave? You just got here." His tone was a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on, Rhea?" She hesitated. Could she trust him? The kindness he'd shown her suggested she could, but trust was a dangerous thing for someone in her position. Still, she couldn't face what was coming alone. "There are people looking for me," she admitted, choosing her words carefully. "Dangerous people. If they find me here, they'll hurt anyone who's helped me." Jake leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but unreadable. "So, what? You're just gonna run? Let them chase you all over the galaxy?" She frowned, her pride bristling at his words. "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Jake said firmly. "And running isn't much of one." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Rhea's mind raced. Could she stand and fight? Could she risk putting Jake and his outpost in danger? She didn't know if she was strong enough for either option. But one thing was certain, her past was catching up to her, and she couldn't outrun it forever. "All right," she said finally, her voice steadying. "But if I stay, you need to understand what you're getting into." Jake gave her a small, determined smile. "I've faced worse than a few dangerous people. You're not scaring me off." For the first time in what felt like ages, Rhea felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she didn't have to face this alone. Perhaps with Jake's help, she could do more than survive. She could fight back. And so, the seeds of a new alliance were sown, one that would soon be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. First contact. The quiet hum of the outpost had become strangely comforting to Rhea over the past few days. Jake had allowed her to stay, offering her a corner of his small home and treating her presence with a surprising amount of normalcy, given her alien origins. He asked questions here and there, but never pushed too hard. He seemed to understand that she needed time to trust him. But trust didn't come easily to Rhea anymore. On the third evening, she sat by the fire, tinkering with a small device she had salvaged from her ship. It was a personal tracker, modified to pick up signals from nearby systems. She was calibrating it to detect any approaching threats when she felt Jake's eyes on her. "That's some advanced tech," he said from across the room, where he was sharpening a knife. His tone was casual, but his curiosity was evident. "It's standard where I come from," Rhea replied, not looking up. Her voice was even, but her fingers tightened around the device. She wasn't sure how much she wanted to reveal. Jake leaned back in his chair, the knife resting on his lap. "You're not like anyone I've ever met. I mean, I've seen aliens before, traders, visitors. But you're different." Her fingers paused, and she finally looked at him. "Different how?" He shrugged, his eyes scanning her face. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to giving orders, someone important." Rhea let out a dry laugh, though it held no humor. "I was important. Once. Now I'm just a fugitive." Jake tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "You don't talk like a fugitive. You talk like someone who still has something to fight for." Her gaze flickered, and for a moment she was silent. Did she still have something to fight for? The thought lingered in her mind, unwelcome and unresolved. Before she could respond, her tracker beeped softly. Her heart leaped into her throat as she glanced at the screen. A faint energy signature was approaching the planet, far too advanced to belong to human technology. Her blood ran cold. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. "They're here," she whispered, her amber eyes narrowing as she stared at the screen. "The king's soldiers." Jake stood immediately, his hand instinctively going to the rifle propped against the wall. "How many?" Rhea studied the tracker, her mind racing. "It's hard to tell. The signal's weak, but they're definitely searching for me. They'll land soon." Jake's jaw tightened. "Well, they're not going to take you. Not without a fight." Rhea's eyes widened slightly. "You don't understand. These aren't ordinary soldiers. They're enhanced. Stronger, faster, more ruthless than anything you've faced." Jake smirked, his confidence unwavering. "You'd be surprised what I faced. But if they're coming here, We need to be ready." He moved quickly, grabbing supplies from a cabinet and pulling out a map of the area. Rhea watched him, her mind torn between admiration and disbelief. Why was he so willing to help her? What did he have to gain? "You don't even know me," she said suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why are you doing this?" Jake paused, looking at her with a calm intensity. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. And because no one deserves to be hunted down for just trying to survive." His words struck a chord in her, stirring emotion she had buried deep. She didn't reply, but she felt a small crack in the walls she had built around herself. "All right," she said finally, stepping closer to him. "If we're going to do this, we need a plan." For the next hour, they worked together, mapping out potential strategies. Rhea used her knowledge of alien technology to suggest traps and defenses, while Jake provided insight into the terrain and the tools at their disposal. It was an odd partnership, an exiled alien queen and a human outpost worker. But it felt strangely natural. As the night wore on, Rhea couldn't shake the feeling that this was the first time in a long time she had felt useful. Her exile had left her feeling discarded, unwanted, but here she was, fighting not just for her survival, but for something bigger. She glanced at Jake, who was focused on rigging a makeshift alarm system, and felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. "Jake," she said softly, drawing his attention. "Thank you." He looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "For what?" "For not asking me to explain everything. For just being here." He gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together now." The simplicity of his words grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. Together. She wasn't alone anymore. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the faint hum of alien engines reached their ears. The soldiers had arrived, their sleek black ship cutting through the sky like a predator. Rhea and Jake exchanged a look, their unspoken agreement clear. They would fight, side by side, no matter what came next. And for the first time since her exile, Rhea felt a glimmer of hope, not just for survival, but for the chance to build something new, something worth fighting for. The alien king's wrath. The sleek, dark ship descended through the atmosphere with an eerie grace, its engines emitting a low hum that reverberated across the rocky terrain. From her vantage point atop a ridge, Rhea watched as the vessel touched down in the valley below. Her amber eyes narrowed, the flickering light from her tracker confirming what she already suspected. They had found her. Beside her, Jake crouched low, scanning the ship through his scope. His rifle rested against his shoulder, steady despite the tension in the air. "How many are we dealing with?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Rhea adjusted her tracker, her fingers trembling slightly. "The signature suggests a squad. 4, maybe 5. But these aren't just soldiers. They're hunters." Jake shifted his gaze toward her. "Hunters." She nodded grimly. "Elite enforcers trained to track and eliminate targets. Their loyalty to the king is absolute, and they don't stop until their mission is complete." Jake exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Well, they're in for a surprise." Rhea glanced at him, a mix of admiration and disbelief in her expression. "You don't even know what they're capable of. Their armor is nearly impenetrable, and their reflexes are enhanced. They're not like anything you've faced." Jake smirked, his confidence unshaken. "I don't need to know what they're capable of. I just need to know that they bleed." Her lips twitched into a faint smile despite the circumstances. His unwavering determination was infectious, and for a brief moment, it tempered the fear gnawing at her. The ramp of the alien ship lowered with a hiss, and 4 figures emerged, their movements fluid and calculated. Each one was clad in obsidian armor that seemed to absorb the light around them. Their helmets, sleek and angular, glowed faintly with red visors that scanned the environment. They moved as a unit, silent and methodical, their weapons at the ready. Rhea and Jake remained hidden behind the ridge, watching as the hunters began their search. One of them raised a device, likely a scanner, and swept it across the landscape. A soft ping echoed, and the hunter turned its head sharply in their direction. "It got our location," Rhea said, her voice tense. "We need to move." Jake nodded, and the two of them slipped away from their perch, moving swiftly but carefully through the rocky terrain. Rhea led the way, her familiarity with alien technology allowing her to anticipate the hunter's tactics. Jake followed close behind, his rifle at the ready. As they descended into a narrow ravine, Rhea activated the small device on her wrist. A holographic map flickered to life, displaying the surrounding area. "We can funnel them through here," she said, pointing to a choke point. "Their numbers won't matter if we can trap them." Jake studied the map, nodding in agreement. "What about their weapons? What are we up against?" "Plasma rifles," Rhea replied. "High energy, long range. But they're not designed for tight spaces. If we can force them into close quarters, we'll have the advantage." Jake grinned. "Sounds like a plan." They worked quickly, setting up makeshift traps using supplies from Jake's outpost and salvaged components from Rhea's ship. Tripwires, improvised explosives, and decoy signals were strategically placed throughout the ravine. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The hunters were closing in, their movements relentless. Rhea could feel the hum of their energy signatures growing stronger, like a storm on the horizon. She glanced at Jake, who was positioning himself behind a cluster of rocks, his rifle trained on the entrance to the ravine. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jake looked at her, his expression calm and resolute. "You trust me?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I do." "Then let's show these hunters they picked the wrong planet." The first hunter entered the ravine, its visor glowing as it scanned the area. A tripwire activated, triggering a small explosion that sent a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The hunter staggered, momentarily disoriented, and Jake seized the opportunity. His rifle barked, the bullet striking a weak point in the hunter's armor and sending it crashing to the ground. The remaining hunters advanced, their plasma rifles firing bursts of searing energy. Rhea ducked behind a boulder, her heart pounding. She activated another trap, releasing a burst of electromagnetic energy that short-circuited one of the hunter's visors. Blinded, it stumbled, and Jake took it down with a well-placed shot. But the remaining two hunters adapted quickly, their movements becoming more calculated. They split up, one advancing toward Rhea, while the other flanked Jake. Rhea's mind raced as she dodged a plasma bolt, her instincts kicking in. She grabbed a shard of her ship's hull, its edge sharp enough to pierce even their advanced armor. The hunter lunged at her, but she sidestepped, using its momentum against it. With a swift motion, she drove the shard into the joint of its armor, disabling its weapon arm. It roared in frustration, but Rhea didn't relent. She struck again, her precision honed by years of training, and the hunter collapsed. Meanwhile, Jake was locked in a tense battle with the final hunter. Its movements were faster than he anticipated, and his rifle was running low on ammo. But Jake's experience and grit kept him one step ahead. He led the hunter into the final trap, a pressure plate rigged to a concealed explosive. The trap detonated, sending the hunter flying and rendering it motionless. The silence that followed was deafening. Rhea and Jake stood amidst the wreckage, their breaths ragged but victorious. Rhea's hands were stained with the glowing fluid that served as the hunter's lifeblood, and Jake's rifle was down to its last shot. "We did it," Jake said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Rhea nodded, but her relief was short-lived. The tracker on her wrist beeped again, and her heart sank. Another signal was approaching, larger, more ominous. "They're sending reinforcements," she said, her voice grim. Jake met her gaze, his expression hardening. "Then we'll be ready." For the first time in her life, Rhea felt a surge of something she hadn't known in years. Hope. Together, she and Jake had survived the King's hunters. And together, they would face whatever came next. Danger approaches. The faint hum of engines vibrated through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. Rhea and Jake stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, their eyes fixed on the sky where a larger, more menacing ship began to emerge. The alien vessel was unlike the sleek craft of the hunters they had just defeated. It was a warship, its dark hull bristling with weapons and pulsating with ominous red lights. Rhea's heart sank. She had expected reinforcements, but this was more than she and Jake could handle alone. Jake lowered his rifle, whistling under his breath. "That's a big one." "It's a battle-class vessel," Rhea said, her voice tight. "They're not here to capture me anymore. They're here to eliminate me, and anyone who helped me." Jake glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Well, that's not exactly comforting." The warship began its descent, landing with a ground-shaking thud in the valley below. Rhea's tracker beeped rapidly, displaying the energy signatures of dozens of life forms emerging from the ship. These weren't just hunters, they were an entire platoon of the king's elite soldiers. Her hands clenched into fists. "We can't fight them all," Rhea admitted, her voice heavy with frustration. "Even with traps, even with your weapons, it won't be enough." Jake was silent for a moment, scanning the advancing troops through his scope. Then he turned to her, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Then we don't fight them all." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Jake knelt, pulling a map of the terrain from his pack. He spread it out on the rocky ground and pointed to a narrow canyon that cut through the nearby mountains. "We can't take them head-on, but we can lead them into a trap, a real one. If we funnel them through here, we can collapse the canyon walls and bury them. It won't get all of them, but it'll thin their numbers." Rhea studied the map, her mind racing. The plan was risky. If the timing was off, they could be caught in their own trap. But Jake's confidence was infectious, and she knew they had no better option. "All right," she said finally, "but we'll need to work fast. They'll be on us in less than an hour." Jake grinned, already packing up the map. "Fast is my middle name." For the next 30 minutes, they worked with a frantic urgency, setting up explosives along the canyon walls and placing decoy signals to lure the soldiers into the narrow passage. Rhea used her alien tech to enhance the traps, rigging them to trigger with precision. Jake handled the physical labor, his strength and experience making up for the time they didn't have. As they finished their preparations, the sound of marching echoed through the valley. The soldiers were moving in formation, their black armor glinting in the sunlight. At the head of the platoon was a figure that made Rhea's blood run cold, a towering warrior clad in ornate crimson armor, his helmet adorned with the insignia of the king's personal guard. "That's a praetor," Rhea said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The king's second in command." Jake adjusted his rifle, his jaw tightening. "I'm guessing he's not here for tea." "No," Rhea said grimly. "He's here to finish what the hunters couldn't." The first wave of soldiers entered the canyon, their movements precise and coordinated. Rhea and Jake lay hidden behind a rocky outcrop, watching as the platoon advanced. The decoy signals had worked, drawing the enemy exactly where they wanted them. Now it was a matter of timing. "Wait for it," Jake whispered, his finger hovering over the detonator. Rhea's heart pounded as the soldiers moved deeper into the canyon. The praetor stood at the entrance, overseeing the operation. He didn't need to enter the trap. His mere presence was enough to send a chill down Rhea's spine. "Now," she said sharply. Jake pressed the button, and the canyon erupted in a deafening roar. Explosives detonated in rapid succession, sending massive boulders crashing down from the cliffs. The soldiers were caught in the chaos, their formations breaking as the ground beneath them shook. Dust and debris filled the air, obscuring their movements. Rhea activated her tracker, scanning for survivors. The trap had worked. Half the platoon was buried beneath the rubble, their energy signatures fading. But the praetor and a handful of soldiers had managed to evade the collapse, their advanced armor protecting them from the worst of it. "They're still coming," she said, her voice tight. Jake nodded, his face grim. "Then we stick to the plan." The next phase of their defense was a series of hit-and-run attacks. Using the terrain to their advantage, Rhea and Jake struck from the shadows, picking off soldiers one by one. Rhea's alien reflexes and knowledge of the enemy's tactics allowed her to outmaneuver them, while Jake's precision and adaptability made him a formidable ally. But the Praetor was relentless. He moved through the battlefield like a predator, his crimson armor making him an unmissable target. Rhea watched in horror as he dispatched one of their traps with ease, his plasma blades slicing through the mechanisms as if they were paper. "We can't stop him," Rhea said, her voice shaking. "He's too powerful." Jake set his jaw, his eyes locked on the Praetor. "Then we don't stop him. We outsmart him." He handed Rhea a small device, a detonator linked to the final explosive they had planted near the canyon's edge. "Take this and go. I'll keep him busy." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "No, you can't fight him alone." "I'm not planning to fight him," Jake said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I just need to buy you time. Go, Rhea." For a moment, she hesitated, torn between her instincts to run and her growing bond with this human who had risked everything for her. But she knew he was right. If they were going to survive, she had to trust him. "Don't get yourself killed," she said, her voice barely steady. Jake grinned. "I'll do my best." As she ran toward the canyon's edge, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and determination. The Praetor was closing in, his crimson armor a beacon of destruction. But Rhea clutched the detonator tightly, knowing that their only chance lay in her hands. The battle wasn't over yet. The true test of their courage was still to come. The fight for survival. The canyon was eerily quiet, save for the crackling of flames from the wreckage of fallen soldiers and the distant rumble of shifting rocks. Rhea crouched behind a boulder at the canyon's edge, her breath shallow and her heart pounding. She clutched the detonator Jake had given her fingers trembling as she watched the Praetor's crimson figure moving through the haze below. His towering form exuded an aura of relentless power, and every step he took seemed to radiate destruction. Jake was down there, buying her time. She couldn't see him through the thick dust, but the sounds of gunfire and the flash of plasma weapons told her he was still holding his ground. Every shot from his rifle echoed like a plea in the vast canyon. "Come on, Jake," she whispered to herself, willing him to stay alive. The Praetor's voice boomed through the canyon, deep and distorted through his helmet speakers. "You cannot hide forever, Rhea. The king's justice is absolute, and your defiance will not be tolerated." Rhea's jaw clenched. The words were a painful reminder of everything she had lost, the life she had been cast out from, the betrayal that had defined her exile. But here, on this small human world, she had found a glimmer of hope, a reason to fight, and she wasn't about to let the Praetor extinguish it. Jake ducked behind a jagged outcrop, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. He could feel the heat of plasma bolts scorching the air around him as the remaining soldiers advanced. He had already taken down 2 more of them, but the Praetor was an entirely different challenge. The hulking alien moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, his plasma blade cutting through obstacles with terrifying ease. "Hey, big guy," Jake shouted, stepping out of cover and firing a shot aimed directly at the Praetor's helmet. The bullet glanced off the reinforced armor, leaving only a faint scorch mark. The Praetor turned his head slowly, his glowing visor locking onto Jake. "You're brave, human. Foolish, but brave." Jake smirked, backing up as the Praetor began to advance. "Yeah, well, I've been called worse." He led the alien toward the base of the canyon wall, where Rhea had planted the final explosive. If he could lure the Praetor close enough, Rhea could trigger the device and bury the remaining soldiers. But the closer the Praetor got, the more Jake realized just how outmatched he was. The alien's speed and strength were almost superhuman, and every swing of his plasma blade came perilously close to connecting. Jake dove behind another boulder, narrowly avoiding a deadly arc of energy that sliced through the rock like butter. His breathing was ragged, but his resolve didn't waver. He just needed a little more time. From her vantage point, Rhea could see the battle unfolding below. Jake was doing everything he could to keep the Praetor occupied, but she knew it wouldn't last. She adjusted her tracker, scanning the area for the remaining soldiers. Two were closing in on Jake's position, their plasma rifles trained on his retreating figure. No, Rhea muttered, her amber eyes narrowing. She couldn't just sit and watch him fight alone. She activated her personal cloaking device, a small but powerful piece of alien tech that rendered her invisible for short bursts. It was a risky move. If the soldiers detected her energy signature, the cloak would fail, but she couldn't let Jake face them alone. Rhea moved swiftly and silently down the canyon wall, her movements graceful despite the tension in her body. She approached the first soldier from behind, her green fingers tightening around the shard of her ship's hull she had kept as a weapon. With a precise strike, she severed the soldier's power pack, disabling his armor and leaving him vulnerable. Before he could react, she delivered a sharp blow to the base of his neck, knocking him unconscious. The second soldier turned, alerted by the sound, but Rhea was faster. She darted forward, using her cloak to close the distance before the soldier could fire. A swift kick to his knee sent him sprawling, and she finished him off with a strike to his helmet that sent sparks flying. Jake caught sight of her as she emerged from the shadows, her cloak flickering off. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by worry. "Rhea, what are you doing?" "Helping you," she replied, her voice firm. She tossed him a power cell she had taken from one of the soldiers. "You'll need this." Jake grinned despite the danger. "I knew you couldn't resist saving my ass." The Praetor, however, was far from impressed. He raised his plasma blade, his deep voice resonating with anger. Enough of these games. He charged toward them, his movements a blur of red and black. Rhea and Jake barely had time to react as the ground shook beneath their feet. The Praetor swung his blade in a wide arc, forcing them to dive in opposite directions. Rhea rolled to her feet, the detonator still clutched in her hand. She glanced at Jake, who was pinned behind a crumbling wall of rock. The Praetor was closing in on him, his weapon glowing with deadly energy. "Jake," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "Get clear of the wall." He understood immediately, scrambling to his feet and running as fast as he could. The Praetor raised his blade to strike, but Rhea didn't hesitate. She pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, a cascade of rock and dust engulfing the canyon. The Praetor roared in fury as the ground gave way beneath him, the collapsing wall burying him and the remaining soldiers in a cloud of rubble. When the dust finally settled, Rhea and Jake stood together, battered but alive. The canyon was silent once more, the Praetor and his troops nowhere to be seen beneath the massive pile of debris. Jake let out a shaky laugh, leaning on his rifle. "Remind me never to doubt your plans." Rhea managed a faint smile, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. Let's hope that was enough. But deep down, she knew the fight was far from over. The king would not stop until she was destroyed, and this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. Still, as she looked at Jake, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. For now, they had survived. And that was enough. A new beginning. The morning sun rose over the battered canyon, its warm rays filtering through the haze of dust and smoke that lingered in the air. For a moment, the world seemed still, almost peaceful, as if the horrors of the previous night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But Rhea's body told her otherwise. Every muscle ached, and the faint hum of her alien tracker served as a constant reminder that their ordeal was far from over. She stood at the edge of the collapsed canyon wall, gazing at the mountain of rubble that had buried the Praetor and his soldiers. Her green skin, now streaked with dirt and blood, glistened faintly in the sunlight. The silence was unnerving, as though the canyon itself was holding its breath, waiting for the dust to settle. Behind her, Jake emerged from the shadows of a makeshift shelter. His face was bruised, and his clothes were torn, but his eyes carried the same determined spark that had kept him alive through the battle. He carried a small bag of supplies slung over his shoulder and a rifle strapped across his back. Despite the grim situation, he managed a faint grin. "You look like you've been through a war," Jake said, his voice tinged with dry humor. Rhea turned to him, her lips curling into a weary smile. "I could say the same about you." He chuckled softly, but the weight of their victory, and the cost, hung heavy in the air. The praetor was gone, but the shadow of the alien king still loomed over them. They both knew that the battle was only a temporary reprieve, a small victory in a much larger war. "We can't stay here," Rhea said finally, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "They'll send more. The king won't stop until he's sure I'm dead." Jake nodded, his expression growing serious. "I figured as much. So, what's the plan?" Rhea hesitated, glancing down at the tracker on her wrist. It displayed a map of the surrounding area, as well as the faint energy signatures of distant patrols. She had spent the night analyzing the praetor's ship before it was destroyed, salvaging what little information she could. The data suggested that the king's forces were spread thin, with most of their attention focused on larger conflicts elsewhere in the galaxy. "There's a resistance movement," Rhea said at last, meeting Jake's gaze. "Scattered groups across different systems, fighting against the king's tyranny. I can try to find them, join them. But it's dangerous. They're constantly on the run." Jake tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like they could use someone like you." "And you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "What about your life here? Your outpost?" Jake let out a small sigh, looking out at the barren landscape. This place was never much of a life. Just a way to keep moving, keep surviving. But after everything we've been through, I think I'd rather have a purpose. Something worth fighting for. Rhea felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, though she tried to hide it. "You're volunteering to join a war against one of the most powerful rulers in the galaxy." Jake smirked. "Well, I've faced worse. Besides, someone's got to watch your back." For the first time in what felt like years, Rhea allowed herself a moment of genuine hope. The prospect of continuing this fight no longer felt like a death sentence. With Jake by her side, the impossible seemed just a little more attainable. The next few days were spent preparing for their departure. Rhea used her knowledge of alien technology to repair a damaged hovercraft they found in the wreckage of the praetor's forces. It wasn't much, but it would get them to a nearby settlement where they could secure a larger ship. Jake gathered supplies, dismantling his outpost and taking only what they needed for the journey ahead. As they worked side by side, a quiet bond grew between them. They didn't need to speak much. Their shared experiences had created an unspoken understanding. Jake's practicality balanced Rhea's strategic mind, and their mutual determination became the foundation of their partnership. On their final night in the canyon, they sat by a small fire, the stars stretching endlessly above them. Rhea stared into the flames, her thoughts drifting back to the life she had left behind. The palace, the king, the betrayal. It all felt like a distant memory now, though the scars it left still lingered. Jake broke the silence. "Do you think we'll win? This resistance you're talking about, do they stand a chance?" Rhea glanced at him, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that if we don't fight, nothing will change. The king will keep ruling through fear, and people like me, like us, will always be running." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then I guess we don't have a choice." She smiled faintly, the weight of his words settling over her. "No, we don't." As dawn broke, they loaded their supplies onto the hovercraft and set off across the rocky terrain. The journey was fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, Rhea felt a sense of purpose. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting for something. For freedom, for justice, for the hope of a better future. Jake sat beside her, his rifle resting across his lap. He glanced at her, his expression calm but resolute. "So, what do we call this little rebellion of ours?" Rhea chuckled softly, the sound light and almost foreign to her. "We'll think of something. For now, let's just focus on surviving." And with that, they sped off into the horizon, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. Together, they were no longer fugitives or outcasts. They were allies, partners, and perhaps something more. Their journey was just beginning, and the galaxy was about to learn that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire that burned brighter than any empire. And for the first time, Rhea believed that they could win.